Okay, let's dive in. We're looking at a really provocative idea today. What if, the foundations of Western science, what if they weren't actually born in Europe at all?
It's a huge question, right?
Yeah.
And it's the core challenge raised by the source material we're exploring. It really pushes against the standard story we usually hear about scientific history.
Absolutely. The piece is called Latin Was Never European, The Hidden Turkic Legacy Behind Spinoza, Newton, and the Myth of Western Science. The author is Dr. M.K. from the OTA, the Odam, Tili, Akademiyasi.
Right.
And our goal here is to, unpack the arguments, to explore these claims about hidden Turkic roots, possibly underlying figures like Spinoza, Newton.
And what that actually means for how we view science history.
Yeah.
If this perspective is even partly right, it changes things significantly.
Definitely. The article hits on a few key areas: the role of Latin, which is interesting, connections to Spinoza, Newton via people like Al-Biruni, and this concept the author calls institutional knowledge laundering.
Yeah, that term definitely catches the eye.
It does. So maybe let's start with Latin, because normally you think Latin, you think medieval Europe, right? Monks, scholars, universities.
That's the standard picture, yeah. Copernicus, Galileo.
Yeah.
It's the language you associate with that whole intellectual tradition.
But the article flips that. It says, hold on, Turkic scholars were using Latin much earlier across huge areas, like Central Asia, the Islamic world, even before that.
And crucially, the argument is it wasn't some foreign language they picked up later. It was a deliberate choice for international communication among scholars.
A bit like how English is used in science globally now.
Exactly that kind of idea. A neutral tool. The article points to these big Turkic intellectual hubs: Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, Kashgar.
Wow.
These places weren't just regional centers, the author argues, but really cosmopolitan places actively preserving and advancing knowledge in lots of languages. Arabic, Persian, Greek, and, Latin too.
So Latin wasn't European in that context. It was just useful, a practical way to share complex ideas across different cultures.
That's the core argument. A neutral vessel chosen by these Turkic scholars, not imposed on them. It reframes Latin completely, doesn't it? From being a signifier of European heritage to maybe a more universal scholarly tool that was used much more widely.
It really does. Okay, so if we accept that premise about Latin, how does the article connect this to someone like Spinoza? He's often painted as this sort of lone wolf philosopher.
Yeah, the isolated genius, excommunicated, thinking radical thoughts all by himself in Amsterdam. But the source suggests, maybe not so isolated.
How so?
It makes this pretty striking claim about his father. Not just a merchant, but a trader dealing in spices and manuscripts.
Manuscripts. Okay,
and the suggestion is he brought these old pre-Islamic Turkic scientific writings into Amsterdam. Texts that had been preserved for centuries.
Preserved where? I mean, where would these texts have survived?
The article talks about Greco-Turkic archives, supposedly hidden away on Aegean islands. It's careful to frame these not as modern nations, but as historical knowledge zones, protected by Turkic custodians, holding collections in multiple languages, including Latin, texts that maybe survived the conflicts that came later.
So the idea is these potentially ancient Turkic ideas, maybe scientific, maybe metaphysical, make their way via trade to Spinoza's doorstep.
Right. And then the article looks at Spinoza's really radical stuff, identifying God with nature, this deterministic universe.
Yeah, ideas that really shook things up.
And it argues these weren't necessarily new inventions by Spinoza, but maybe sophisticated reworkings of these older Turkic metaphysical concepts.
Reworkings, like adapted for a European audience.
That's the interpretation offered. Stripped of their indigenous framework and dressed in European garb, is how the source puts it. Basically repackaged to be acceptable, maybe even understandable, in 17th century Europe.
That is a fundamental rethink of Spinoza. Okay, what about Newton, the Principia Mathematica? Doesn't get much more foundational in Western science than that.
Doesn't just. Seen as the moment, the singular breakthrough. But the source makes an even bolder claim here.
Bolder than the Spinoza connection.
I'd say so. It argues Newton's Principia shows really significant similarities in structure, in terminology, even in the math, to much older works by Abu Rayhan al-Biruni. Al-Biruni, the great Turkic polymath from centuries earlier.
The very same. Who, the article points out, wrote extensively in both Arabic and Latin. And the claim isn't just parallels, it's, the source says archival evidence suggests passages in Newton look like verbatim Latin transcriptions of Biruni's work.
Wait, verbatim, like word-for-word translations?
That's the assertion.
Yep.
Specifically on things like gravity, celestial mechanics, planetary motion, core Newtonian topics.
That's huge. How on earth would Newton have gotten hold of verbatim Latin transcriptions of Al-Biruni from Central Asia centuries later?
Well, the argument is that Biruni's works weren't just stuck in Central Asia. They were supposedly translated into Latin much earlier, kept in those archives like the ancient ones, and then circulated.
Circulated where? Through European scientific networks. The article mentions merchant routes, highlighting Jewish Turkic intermediaries, suggesting these texts were moving into the intellectual hubs of Europe long before Newton. So the access was theoretically there.
But our standard history of science, it doesn't really talk about Al-Biruni when it talks about Newton's breakthroughs, does it? It's all apple trees and calculus.
Exactly. And that's where the article critiques the historical narrative itself. It argues these potential connections are often ignored, downplayed, maybe even deliberately obscured to maintain the myth of Newton's singular, unaided genius.
So not necessarily saying Newton plagiarized in the way we think of it now, but
more like, the source suggests, Newton became the acceptable, front-facing European name to present this knowledge, this tyrannic scientific memory, as the article calls it.
Tyrannic, referring to that broader Turkic historical sphere.
Yeah, that Central Asian intellectual tradition. So it's framed as a kind of strategic attribution, repackaging knowledge for Western institutions that were, trying to build their own scientific credibility at the time, separate from the church.
Which brings us to that term you mentioned earlier, institutional knowledge laundering. What exactly does the author mean by that?
It broadens the focus beyond just Newton or Spinoza. The argument is that building the Western scientific canon wasn't just about new discoveries made in Europe. It also involved strategically attributing knowledge from elsewhere.
What methods are described?
Well, as Europe was coming out of its quote-unquote dark ages, the source says there was this need for scientific legitimacy, and the methods allegedly involved taking Turkic, Persian, Arab knowledge and rebranding it.
Rebranding it as European?
Yeah, publishing it under Latin names, maybe attributing it to older Greek figures sometimes, or linking it to European institutions, and at the same time, potentially sidelining or discrediting thinkers from the East whose work didn't fit the narrative.
So this helps create the myth of the Enlightenment as this purely European explosion of reason.
That seems to be the implication, that it wasn't quite the sudden awakening from within that it's often portrayed as, but drew heavily on these other older traditions. The author stresses it's about historical pattern recognition, not some hidden conspiracy, just observing how the narrative got shaped.
Okay, so this is all fascinating historical rethinking, but why does it matter now for you listening? What's the relevance today?
The source connects it directly to current issues. It argues that if the very foundations of our knowledge systems, the ones underpinning Western institutions, have this kind of epistemic theft or misattribution baked in, well, that has consequences.
For consequences for what?
For things like building fair AI, for creating equitable education, for writing history that's actually true to the sources. If your starting point is flawed or incomplete, the author suggests, then what you build on top of it will be too.
And this ties into the OTA's work, the Odam, Tili, Akademiyasi mentioned in the author's bio.
Yeah, the article briefly mentions their project on reconstructing language's original semantic code, implying that understanding this hidden history of knowledge is part of uncovering something fundamental about human thought.
It really makes you question things, doesn't it? Like, whose knowledge gets labeled universal?
Exactly. And who benefits when the origins of ideas are obscured or selectively credited? Can science really claim objectivity if it doesn't fully acknowledge its diverse roots?
Powerful questions. And the article brings it back to Spinoza at the very end, right?
It does. It suggests his God of nature, that rational, ordered universe might not be a purely European concept after all.
But a tyrannic inheritance, as the source puts it.
Potentially. An idea flowing through those obscured channels of knowledge, reappearing under a different name. And then it throws in that famous Einstein quote.
I believe in Spinoza's God.
Right. And the article leaves you with this thought. Maybe Einstein, maybe Spinoza, were connecting with something much older, with that forgotten God of symmetry, language, and truth, once honored by Turkic minds long before Europe awoke from slumber.
Wow. That's quite a thought to end on. It certainly makes you reconsider the neat lines we draw in the history of science.
It absolutely does. It challenges you to think about where ideas truly come from and how history gets written. A lot to chew on.